There is a notable disagreement between Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now, Elizabeth Warren was certainly one of Yellen's promoters in this post as Treasury Secretary, so it's not like they have bad blood, but this is Warren, in my opinion, in the best environment for her to shine when she's speaking truth to power in these Senate hearings. And in this particular case, she wants to understand why it is that a company like BlackRock, which has not, it's currently dealing with $9 trillion of wealth that they're managing. Why is it that they don't have the proper classification to ensure that they're regulated appropriately? Before I get to the details of that exchange, though, I think it is important to kind of understand what Yellen has done so far in this post as Treasury Secretary. And one thing that I'm particularly sensitive to is this notion of corporate stock buybacks, especially when it comes to corporations and banks that have been bailed out, especially when it comes to corporations and banks that the Federal Reserve has provided cheap money to in the form of quantitative easing. And so Yellen has decided that no, it's totally fine. Let's allow these banks to buy shares of their own stock again. I have been opposed earlier when they were very concerned about the situation the banks would face about stock buybacks, but financial institutions look healthier now, and I believe they should have some of the liberty provided by the rules to make returns to shareholders. She also says this, which makes me want to pull my hair out. The Fed's move to allow buybacks to resume came after the largest, this is actually from CNBC, came after the largest institutions showed they could weather worst case scenarios centered around the pandemic. Central bank officials have largely praised the industry's COVID response and said the too big to fail firms remain well capitalized. The Federal Reserve printed money and handed it over to them. What are they talking about? Like, the way they're framing this makes it seem as though like, oh, all of this great responsible behavior by these banks, they really know what they're doing. And let's not pat them on the backs when it came to the small business loans. These banks did an awful job in distributing them to the businesses that actually needed it. Instead, they decided to hand that money over to their own clients, which is a huge issue, right? It was a huge flaw in the way that that money went out. But with that said, Cenk, let's go to what Elizabeth Warren is concerned about. Specifically, Warren suggested that BlackRock, the institutional money management giant and leading ETF provider, should be designated as a systemically important financial institution, or it's also known as SIFI. That is a firm that could put the economy at risk if it were to collapse. And since they're managing $9 trillion in wealth, it is a giant institution, and should they make mistakes, and it could lead to an economic collapse. That's the point she's trying to make, and here's how that exchange went down.
It's not obvious to me that designation is the correct tool to address.
Well, wait just a minute. Designation is what gives the Fed its increased oversight power. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is BlackRock currently designated so that it receives that increased oversight?
It isn't designated, but I think it's important to understand.
So that means it is not receiving the increased oversight from the Fed. So my question is, are you currently looking at designation for companies like BlackRock, $9 trillion companies like this?
Well, as I said, FSOC has looked at this issue in the past.
I understand they've done it in the past. I'm not asking about what the last Secretary of the Treasury did. You are the head of FSOC now. And the question I'm asking is whether or not FSOC is considering and looking at designation for these large financial institutions.
They should.
Wow. I think Yellen just got FSOC'd. So look, that was Elizabeth Warren at her best. And the context that Anna gave you is really important. She backs Yellen to become Treasury Secretary. Yellen walks into this ambush thinking, oh, here's someone who supports me. And Warren's like, no, wait a minute. This is about policy. Let's get real here. So this is why I liked Warren in the first place, because this is accountability that she's asking for from the executive branch. All right, so just a little bit more on this issue. Look, the designation, as Warren is explaining there, allows the Treasury Secretary to check in. It doesn't mean that they have to take any action. It just means they're allowed to regulate them. I don't see why we wouldn't do that with a $9 trillion company. So that's an excellent point, nearly indisputable. But the point I want to make is I haven't seen anywhere else. You can't tell us that we're not going to regulate them. And then if it turns out you're wrong and they were a systemic risk, then turn around and say we need to bail them out. No, you got to pick one. So one thing that they could suggest, I don't know if they're even thinking about this at all, but Warren should suggest a bill, for example, that says if you're not a company that's considered a systemic risk, if you go bankrupt, we will definitely not bail you out. All the shareholders will get zero from the American taxpayer. It's an ironclad law. If you want the protection, you need to get the regulation. If you don't want the regulation, then you don't get the protection. That's how it works.
You know that $9 trillion is greater than the GDP of every single country with the exception of the United States and China. That's how much $9 trillion is. Like, no, that's just why let that sink in.
No, Anna, that's such a great point because it's a joke to say they're not a systemic risk. If anything went wrong with BlackRock, they would instantly all scream from the rooftops, we were a systemic risk, and that's why we need to be bailed out because, it's dominoes, and that endangers all the other companies, and then endangers the cities and the states, and everything that BlackRock touches. Well, then okay, by definition, you're a systemic risk, and we have to regulate. So they want it both ways. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the Biden administration, like with the Obama administration, the Trump administration, Bush administration, et cetera, they're all worked for these giant corporations or got giant amounts of money from those corporations. So lo and behold, they say, no, I wanna keep their costs low and not regulate. In other words, not have cops check in to see if they're doing the right thing. And if it turns out, whether it's just errors on their part, wild risk taking, or they were actually robbers on the street, right? And they did something wrong on purpose. Well, we're gonna bail them out anyway. No, the American people are absolutely sick and tired of that. The right wing is sick and tired of it, and so is the left wing. It's about time that people like Elizabeth Warren regulated. I don't know, that's the job of a senator. Every Democrat and Republican senator should be doing that. It's an absolute shame that there's only one doing it.
And Cenk, since you implied that there's corruption and corruption basically leading to the kinds of decisions that people like Yellen are making. I do want to provide receipts for that because the truth of the matter is BlackRock, as I mentioned, is the largest money manager in the world with nearly $9 million in assets. Now, the firm last helped guide the Fed when the central bank was buying corporate bonds. So, the close relationship between the corporate world and government is a problem. Now let's focus on how this impacts the Biden administration. BlackRock alumni have been accepted in or are in line for top jobs within the Biden administration, including the former senior advisor at the asset manager who was president, who the president has picked to be deputy Treasury Secretary. During his confirmation process, Warren actually questioned him, but refrained from asking whether FSOC should designate BlackRock. The Senate is expected to soon vote on his nomination. Also, Vice President Kamala Harris tapped Mike Pyle, BlackRock's former chief investment strategist, to be her top economic advisor, and Brian Deese, who was the firm's global head of sustainable investing, leads Joe Biden's National Economic Council. So look, all of this stuff is relevant, right? Because it's that same revolving door of politics that leads to the corruption and it leads to bad regulatory decisions being made. And in the case of a company that has, $9 trillion in assets, yes, it's definitely too big. It should have to deal with the same regulations and more robust regulations, if you ask me, that other large institutions have to abide by.
Yeah, by the way, that's why we told you that corporations love Kamala Harris, because they know that if she gets in charge, she's gonna stuff all of her advisors from Wall Street, and that's exactly what she's doing. And she raised a lot of money from Wall Street. So and look, even if those are good people, and I'm sure they're smart people, their assumptions are that industry and corporations on Wall Street are awesome, and that they should be rewarded and they should be supported and unregulated. So when you stuff your administration full of people with those assumptions, you're playing with fire. But I'm gonna give the last word to two of our members, tyt.com/join, to do the show with us. Carlson is a lying mother Tucker, unsurprisingly sent in a sarcastic comment. Oh, looky there, has Elizabeth Warren woken from her slumber? Maybe she had a cup of too strong coffee. Now, I wouldn't blame her if she did, okay, but give her credit where credit is due. And finally, Jam wrote in, nobody's stupid enough to honestly believe a firm managing $9 trillion in wealth can't tank their economy. That's almost half of the USA's GDP, good fact. Of course they need heightened oversight and regulation. Look, do we have the smartest audience in the world? I guess.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.